different projects around insight. And over the last couple of months, he's been trying to look at how we develop our insight and understanding around walking behaviour. As Scott has successfully got his slides up, I will let him take over and tell you a little bit more about our session today. Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Jade, and good morning, everyone. I'm glad, Jade, that you have given me all the credit for the hard work that's gone into this, because it certainly wasn't me. Martin's on the call somewhere, who's been kind of trying to make sense of some of the data that we've got to help us kind of unpick walking behaviour and hopefully inform some of the decisions that we can make. So if we've got any questions, they're probably best putting in the chat, and we'll pick them up at the end. If they're technical questions, I can hand them over to Martin, because I probably can't answer them anyway. But please do just kind of capture your questions as we go through, and we can come back to them and go back to over the slide if we need to. What am I going to cover? We were challenged by Joe and Heather and Jade to try and unpick this kind of everyday walking. You'd think that'd be quite easy to do in an active life survey that surveys 500 people in every local authority, at least 500 people in every local authority in the country on a rolling basis, and it has a lot of information in there about walking, but it wasn't as easy as maybe it could have been. And so what I'm going to do is just tell you a little bit about the measures and how we've decided to look at this information and kind of bring that to life. And then I've got a little bit about what's happening at the kind of Derbyshire level. I've got a little bit for the local authorities, just the headlines at the moment. And as Jade said, we're building up some more kind of local intelligence. And then I'm going to get into demographics. I'm going to get into, you know, this is a group of people that have a limit, that recognize themselves that they have a limited illness or disability, and then you've got obviously those that say that they don't. And I think everything else on there. Oh, minority ethnic group. We've had to, because of the sample size, we've had to put all diverse groups together. So that would include people that are white, other, Eastern Europeans, etc. It would include people from the Asian community, from our Black communities, from our Arabic communities. We've had to put all of that together to be able to have a sample big enough to be able to look at it in Derbyshire, because Derbyshire isn't incredibly diverse. It's getting more diverse, but at the moment it isn't, and the sample that we get from that part of our community is quite small. Then let's have a look at the data. You can see there's some really quite striking differences. The first is look at the inequality between NSSEC 1 and 2 on the far right, where we're down to 1 in 4 of that group not really walking, and then NSSEC 6 to 8, where we're up to 4 in 10. And so we've got some really quite interesting inequalities. This walking stuff turns age on its head. It's usually our 55 to 74-year-olds that are more likely to be inactive than our 16 to 34-year-olds. But when it comes to walking, our 55 to 74-year-olds are more likely to rely on minutes from walking to get their activity in, and whereas 16 to 34s probably do some other things. And then you've got this limiting illness, and you've got our minority ethnic communities that are also experiencing higher levels of not walking, and they're less likely to walk. You can see we've plotted there's a lot on this slide. I know there is, but it'll be useful as a reference point. All we're doing here is just looking at the trend. So we've got all of those same groups, and we're looking at the 6 years of data to try and make sense of what's happening with the trend. The general pattern across here is that most of these groups are following the overall pattern that I mentioned at the beginning, that things are improving, that inactive walkers is decreasing amongst most of these groups. Two of the groups where it isn't, limiting illness and NSSEC 6 to 8. Okay, NSSEC 6 to 8 was improving a bit before the pandemic. The pandemic happened, pushed it back up to its highest point. It's bounced back a little bit. It's still pretty flat overall. And then limiting illness, you can see it's really been pretty stable. And then pandemic's just pushed it up a little bit, and it's higher than it was in the first year of data. So these are two of the groups that certainly across the county, and when we start to get into the local data, that we'll be looking at in a little bit more detail, because we've got higher levels of inactive walking there. I'm going to delve into the NSSEC 6 to 8 in a little bit more detail shortly, but I just want to pick up on a couple of other factors first. Okay, just going into that ethnicity data, we've had to kind of unpick it into smaller groups than just saying all minority ethnic groups, we've had to aggregate the data. So we've put all years of data that we can get our hands on, the 6 years of data together to be able to do this. So it's a little bit different to the other charts. But what this then clearly shows is that our black communities are much more likely to be experiencing lower levels of walking. Our Asian community too, our white other, which is probably the biggest ethnic group in Derbyshire. I think I can check that. Again, higher than average. So we need to just be thinking about what that looks like. If you're wondering whether why that white British is 34% and yet we know overall it's 32, it's because we've aggregated the data. So it's got all 6 years of data in here. So it just makes some of those values a little bit different. So we've got a bit more of a challenge in our diverse communities, particularly within our Black and Asian communities. We also know that inactivity is often higher amongst those that are unemployed, and walking, that group is also less likely to walk. This is again, we've had to aggregate the data to do this. Getting to work, retired people, that not working group, if you're wondering what that is mainly going to be retired people. So you can see how the difference of being unemployed that it makes. Also note the student one though as well, and there, back to that young people angle here, and I am going to be coming back to this in a minute when I get into a bit more depth. There's something around younger people and walking and how they view walking and their habits for getting active in other ways. But we certainly got a bit more of a challenge around people that are out of work. I don't think this will surprise anyone. I think this has come out as we would expect it to come out, which basically shows us that when we look at it via deprivation, we've had to put the indices of multiple deprivation is split into 10 groups. The data is more robust if we put those actually into 4 quartiles rather than the 10 groups. So you've got our most deprived quartile on the end, where you've got a proportion of people that are inactive walkers above 4 in 10, and it's down to 3 in 10 in our least deprived communities. I don't think that would surprise anyone. I'm going to make a comment here now about this little thread that we've got going here. So we've got lower socioeconomic communities, we've got our diverse communities, particularly Black and Asian parts of our community. We've got unemployed people, and we've got deprivation. All of those factors, those groups, are more likely to come together in urban areas. They are, our diverse communities are more likely to live in our bigger towns. Low socioeconomic groups are more likely to be in our bigger towns. Not completely though in Derbyshire, because of the industrial heritage, which we need to keep in mind in this. But there is certainly a thread in here around urban and what that looks like and what walking looks like in our urban areas. We will try and unpick that when we get into some of the local data. I'm not going to get into it today though, but there is certainly a thread there, and I'll show you, we'll connect it to kind of types of walking behavior in a minute or two. So as I said, I'm going to spend a little bit of time just getting under the skin a little bit of this our lower socioeconomic communities, because there's some interesting patterns when you start to look at this group that might be a bit of a surprise. You might not think so, but when I looked at the data, I certainly found it a little bit surprising. So just to show you that NSX, so this is all of those NSX groups that I mentioned earlier. 6 and 7 and 8 are the 2 columns on the right. 6 and 7 are people, as I mentioned earlier, in semi-routine and routine work. What on earth does that mean? Retail, working on shop floors, labourers, cleaners, that kind of occupation would be in that space. Now, what do those people do or are more likely to do? More likely to do manual work, more likely to be on their feet all day. What does walking then look like to them when they've already spent a lot of time on their feet? Is something that we need to get more intelligent about understanding. NSX 6 to 8 are people that have never worked or are long-term unemployed. This would include people on disability benefits. And you can see just how high the proportion of inactive walkers is amongst that group, part of our community. So there's certainly some thinking to be done around this. And then actually you can see some other bits of the NSSEC. I'm not going to focus on them today, where things are a bit higher than we'd probably like as well. But we've certainly got to be thinking about our lower socioeconomic communities, their lifestyle that might be more associated to manual work, and what that means for how we can encourage people to walk more and get more minutes through walking. When you break our lower social communities down, at this NSSEC group down, you get some quite interesting patterns. What you find is that limiting illness is no surprise. We've seen that through the whole of the county data, that's the group. So if you're in lower socioeconomic communities and you've got a limiting illness, you're even more, you're even less likely to walk. Okay, but men, I was really surprised at men being, on the left-hand side of the screen, and then our 16 to 34s, which comes back to that thread that I pointed out earlier of it not, walking maybe not being the thing that they do to be active. So what have we got to do? What are our tactics to try and shift that? What is it that we can do to try and get our messaging right, get our campaigns right, get our communication going with that age group, but also building it back into lives, which I will come back to it a little bit later. But also look at the difference between men and women on here. I might have a little bit of insight into that. It's using some information from elsewhere, and I'll bring that out on a slide a little bit later on. But there's a couple of groups there that I was quite surprised at in terms of them coming out as being less likely to walk often. Okay, stick with me on this slide. It takes a little bit of explaining, but it's a great slide. Okay, what you've got here is basically how often people went for a walk in each of these years, and it's split by walking for leisure, the light blue towers, and walking for travel, the dark blue towers. And we've got it for each of the 6 years of the data in Derbyshire. The size of the block, the depth of the block relates to the length of duration the walk was, the average length of the duration of the walk. Okay, so what you start to see here is this pattern of walking for leisure, 7 up to 8, down to 7 again. Then the pandemic's come along, late 2 years of data. This is NS 6 to 8 again, specifically. It's pushed back up to 8, but the towers have got higher because the average session length has got longer. Okay, now look what has happened to walking for travel. Walking for travel 6, dropped to 5, shrinking a little bit pre-pandemic, boom, drops. It's now down to 3. Now those sessions are a little bit longer than they were pre-pandemic, but we have lost sessions of walking for travel. When Martin and Liz showed me this slide for the first time, the thing that dropped into my head was, well, that's the pandemic shifting people walking to and from work. I've now seen some other data, which I'll come on to on the next slide, where I'm not so convinced it is that. Might be partly that, but I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. What this slide shows is the impact on minutes that we get from these two different motivations for walking. Look at how the walking for leisure minutes have gone up since 1819. And then look what's happened to walking for travel minutes contributing to people's physical activity levels. They've almost halved since the pandemic hit. So that drop of those sessions, even though the remaining sessions have got a bit longer, that drop of sessions has removed nearly half of minutes that people get from walking for travel. Who's more likely to walk for travel? Women, our diverse communities, lower socioeconomic groups, young adults. Okay, when I first saw this, it made me think of shifting working patterns. I then see some data recently from Greater Manchester. So it's, we've got to just treat it with a bit of caution.
I think we have temporarily lost Scott.
But it's not.
Scott, we lost you as you were holding your head deep in thought. So you were just talking about Greater Manchester.
Which bit had I got to, Jade, just so I can carry on where you lost? Literally,
you'd said taking it with a
all right, okay, taking it with a pinch of salt.
Yes.
So what we know from Greater Manchester is that those places that people are most frequently walk to, basically walking for travel, work is not at the top of the list. It's actually almost nearly at the bottom of the list. What's at the top of the list is green spaces. Actually, they've made a little list so I don't forget them. Green spaces is number one. 3/4 of people walking to and from green spaces and open spaces. Almost half of people walking their kids to primary schools, places of worship, GP and pharmacy, job centre, banks, kids walking kids to secondary school, food shops. All of them and a couple more are above walking to and from work for minutes, okay, in Greater Manchester. What struck me about this list, though, was this was pre-pandemic data, and I was like saying, please repeat your survey because I really want to see what's happened now. What struck me about that list, though, was how many of those things have gone online since the pandemic hit. GPs online, pharmacies repeat prescriptions online, job centres online, banks online. We had 5 banks in this town when I moved here 7 years ago. There's none, and the last 2 closed in the pandemic. Okay, the point that I'm trying to make here is these little places that we would often pop to have gone online significantly, and that's removed minutes, and that'll be part of the mix alongside at work, shifting working patterns, particularly for NS 6 to 8. And these things aren't coming back. A lot of them aren't going to come back. GPs might, but there's still a big question mark about to what scale that comes in. They're going to become hybrid. And so that has implications because we've removed all of these short journeys. The average journey time for all of these places that I've just met was between 10 and 15 minutes. Okay, so that's all been removed. And what's really important here, thinking about our active 20-minute neighborhoods, it's not 20 minutes. The average minutes for all, there was only university, walking to and from university, which was at an average of about 18.5 minutes in Greater Manchester. All the others were between 10 and 13 minutes. And that's where we need to be thinking about what do we do in engineering, re-engineering our neighborhoods to enable some of these easy way of picking up short walking trips, because they contribute enormously. What's positive in this slide is that people are conscious, some people are conscious that they've lost that walking for travel and they are replacing it with walking for leisure. What does that mean for our tactics? What does that mean for the way that we need to be thinking about what we're trying to encourage people into? It's something that we really need to have a chat about and think about the implications of. Right, this is another helpful way that Martin and Liz have looked at the data. They've been able to look at where people, who people walk with. And you notice some quite interesting differences here, where when you look at it alone, there's very little difference between people in lower socioeconomic communities and everybody else. 18% of people in lower socioeconomic communities have walked alone, 19% of all other adults. Now look at walking with others and how much difference they are. And look at that, walking with family over the age of 16, walking with other people, really quite striking. And when you add that up, it makes a big difference. So what is it about our lower socioeconomic communities that we're not walking with others for the social benefits? What do we understand about that anecdotally? What can we add to that to try and understand why we've got that pattern? Just another one for us to be thinking about as well is lower, and I've got some big assumptions in my head about why we've got this pattern, but they could be completely wrong, like I was about the walking to work and the shift in active travel. Start or finish somewhere else. People in lower socioeconomic communities more likely to do that than everyone else. Start and finish at home, significantly less likely to start and finish their walk at home than people in other. Now, my part of that would be, for me, environment and where our lower socioeconomic communities live in Derbyshire and their potential connection to green space and the ease of that, the perceived ease of that. There's lots of other things in there, isn't there? Safety, etc., etc., etc. But there's a really striking difference there, that they're much less likely to finish their walk, start their walk and finish it from home, which is really intriguing. So I'd love to hear people's thoughts on that. Very quickly on children and young people. Children and young people data is a bit harder to play with, to kind of tease the walking stuff out. I won't go into lots of detail now, but if you're interested in understanding why, then drop me a question or drop me an email and I can explain. What we can do though is we can look at those that have done some walking once in the last week. What I would observe before we go any further with this data is children and young people rely considerably less on walking for their minutes than adults do. So roughly walking contributes around 50% of all minutes. Walking for leisure and walking for travel added together contributes around 50% of all minutes for adults. It's probably about 20%-ish for, give or take, for young people. It's a considerably amount. Sport is much more important. Dance, fitness, riding bikes and scooters, active play contribute a lot of minutes for children and young people, and walking is a smaller part of the picture. What you've got over the last 4 years that we've got the data is the pandemic came along and it pushed up once a week walking across children and young people. Certainly my experience in my family as we tried to manage homeschooling. Let's go for a walk. That's a good idea. We'll get out of the house again. So interesting that that's gone up. Can we keep it up? That's a really big challenge for us. You've got some really interesting differences here, again, probably mirroring what we've seen in some of the others, that actually the groups that are more likely to walk once a week, girls and children in low family affluence, with a low family affluence score. What on earth is that? We can't use this NSEC questions for children and young people. We use a set of questions in the survey that puts children into either low affluence families, medium affluence families, or high affluence families. And that's what that low FAS, medium FAS and high FAS is. And so you can see that our low and medium affluence family children are more likely to walk, which is positive. Okay, they're much less likely to play sport and some other things, and that's where our inequalities can open up. All right, not much difference. There is a bit of difference between white British and our more diverse communities, but you've got this big difference in boys and girls, which is intriguing, and I will come back to that shortly. In fact, I'll come back to it now. Look what's happening in the trend amongst girls. Now, we have seen this nationally. Activity levels since the pandemic came along have gone up for girls and gone down for boys. And one of the reasons they've gone up for girls is what's happening for teenage girls, and walking is driving it. So there is something in fashion, I don't know if that's the right word at all, but there is something positive that's happening around walking for girls, but particularly for teenage girls. How do we bottle that, and how do we continue to get that growth? Because look at the change from baseline. It's really quite significant. Can we keep that going, or at least keep it up? Because that would be very positive. And then you've got the very similar pattern for low affluence families. Again, that's really positive. What I would just say in this, though, is the implications for the rest of outside of the walking work is choice. What this means for these groups in terms of, this might be the only way that they get minutes. And what does that mean for long term? That's something else that we might need to think about on another day. That's it. That's me. I think I'm on time. I said to Jade, I'd do it on time, and I have, I think. This is just a summary of the things that I picked up hopefully I've picked up as I've gone along. This urban element, this connectivity to local places that are within this kind of 10-15 minute walking time. If you want to try and shift walking behavior, it's looking what that looks like, and connecting that to our, making sure our communities are connected to our green spaces, because people walk to them and they then walk for leisure, etc., etc. So we've got this whole space, I think, that we need to try and get our heads around, because those groups, low socioeconomic, Black and Asian communities, unemployment will all be that bit higher in our deprived urban areas. I'm done. Shall I stop sharing? Actually, I won't now, just in case there's any questions from anyone.
Perfect. I'm very impressed, Scott. And we have got, before we go into some breakout rooms to explore a little further, we have got a few minutes for questions. And I guess just my general reflection, I've heard that a few times now, and still hearing new messages within that. So so I can't wait to hear what everybody else has been thinking. And I guess for me, the challenge back to all of us is, how do we use the insight and the evidence that we're starting to gather to really help to inform how we utilise our resources, our energy, and our focus? It'd just be a thought to leave with everybody. But I'll stop talking There are a few interesting comments in the chat. So if anyone has got their hands up, I'll come to Derek very shortly. I'll just go through, Scott, if that's okay, a couple of questions. So Sarah had asked about how we better understand attitudes and if there was any research. And I know that there is some data, and I don't know how that links with walking.
There is some stuff in Active Lives. It kind of looks at it through like the COM-B model, and we haven't quite worked out how to use it yet. Greater Manchester, and we have asked for permission to. In fact, I think the slide deck that Nick presented, there's some really interesting stuff in some of their data, in some of the data that their own data collection that they've been doing. And if we can get permission to share that slide deck, it'd be worth sharing that slide deck, and you can have a look at it, because it comes into attitudes and it connects it to a segmentation model called Acorn, Khaki Acorn, I think it is, where it starts to use these groups and look at different factors. So I think there might be some stuff nationally as well. Sport England did a document at one point where they looked at different activities and different ethnicities kind of propensity to take part in those activities, and I think that had some attitudinal stuff in it, published about 3 years ago off the top of my head. Yeah, so there's bits out there, but it is certainly an area where I think this work needs to pick up. We need to understand in some of the communities what people's views of walking are. We've heard very different things over the years, from it's a sign of poverty for some diverse groups. Getting a car is actually seen as a very positive thing, so that becomes a factor. All of this, it's quite intriguing. Somewhere where we need to improve, I think.
Thank you very much, Scott. If I bring Derek in, as Derek's sat with his hand up with your question, Derek.
Yeah, I was intrigued by the phrase that walking rates have recovered from early pandemic disruption. Now, as I remember early pandemic so-called disruption, you couldn't move for people out walking. Yeah,
but Derek, that'd be certain groups. So to give you a really good example of this, when you look at the Derbyshire data around physical activity, if I remember rightly, average minutes across, so all of the minutes that we did across all activities in Derbyshire in the early part of the pandemic went up, but those doing nothing also went up. So what's that telling us? Those that could did more. So people that like myself went out and walked more, and I was already walking, but I then started walking even more, and those that didn't. So you've got this really interesting split going on there. And so what you've got in this data is it's showing the impact of the lower socioeconomic communities and those with a limited illness and disability that didn't go up to the scale of maybe those middle socioeconomic groups and higher socioeconomic that did and went out more often, and they're the people that you kept bumping into. That would be my answer to it.
Well, thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm just having a quick look if we've got time for one more question. If anyone else has got that before we head over.
There's one from Joe about, does walking to the train station or bus stop count as walking for travel? Yes, it would do. It would definitely be in the walking. It'd be part of the commute, which would definitely be part of the walking for travel data.
Perfect. Thank you.